I'm Tom Mitzi, Theater Director at the Thousand Oaks Civic Arts Plaza, and today my guest is Joe Leggett. Joe, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Joe, when did you come to the Conejo Valley?
Well, I first contacted the Conejo Valley in 1958. I was a CPA and I started doing quite a bit of work for the Jan's Investment Corporation. And eventually I got doing so much work that I went to work for the corporation, and I moved out here in 1962. And I've been here ever since.
What are your earliest memories of the Conejo Valley?
Well, it was my earliest memories go way back when I was a kid driving through here with a little two-lane road, and Jungle Land wasn't even functioning back in the 20s. And then I recall the 50s, it was just sort of it was just starting. And my recollection is that a study by the Stanford Research Institute, wherein the Jans had retained them, and they made a study about defining Thousand Oaks the way it was going to be, and it was going to be an integrated city with all its industry, schools, with commercial, homes. Everybody live here, work here, go to school here, and that's the way it was intended to be. Well, it didn't turn out that way. It was commuters who eventually came here, but now it's getting back that way again. And it was this great move, a quantum leap from the West Valley to here. And that's my first recollection. The Conejo Theater with no houses, nothing around, and a shopping center out in the middle of nowhere, the old Jan's Mall. That's my earliest recollection.
And how has Thousand Oaks changed since you've been here?
Well, it's just, it's had a very orderly growth. We've been fortunate in having some very dedicated elected officials that have been some wonderful staff that have done a magnificent job in developing the city in a very a very fine way. They had a lot of disputes, a lot of differences. If we look back at them, nothing. Rockwell Center, there was a huge outcry. The regional shopping center, I thought that was going to be the end of the world, and things all happened. Even this right here, the City Hall and the Cultural Center was a very highly debated matter. But it's here, everybody's happy with it. Things turned out very, very well.
How has Thousand Oaks remained the same?
Well, it's always had, I remember the very first, the slogan was, if you go to the city council meetings, where I used to go all the time, people would come up one after another, and they'd all say, they're very profound. They'd look at the council, look at them, and they'd say, "You're not going to make another San Fernando Valley out of Thousand Oaks." And they all figured they were saying it for the first time, but I bet you talk to any council member, they've heard that 100 times. And they've done a good job about not making another San Fernando Valley. I didn't say that, I meant not making another San Fernando Valley.
Mm-hmm. If you were going to describe Thousand Oaks to someone who'd never been here, what would you tell them?
Well, I'd tell them it was a very interesting city, that it was one that was not part of the urban sprawl. That was part of the beauty of it, that there was a quantum leap from the west Woodland Hills to here. That's about 15 miles. And it started out from the very bone structure. They had to form a sewer company, and one time I was president of the world's largest privately owned sewer company. And the water company we had to form to get this city going and get it underway, the Jan's Investment Corporation.
What's your most memorable experience living here in Thousand Oaks?
Well, there's so many. It's just hard really now to hit one recollection that was really, I could probably just tell you one, but if I'll leave here and I'll say, oh, I would know a better one than that, a better one than that. But there's just so many of them that it's so very, very difficult to pin one of them. So many wonderful things have happened in the city that I just really, just the city, it's the 35, 40 years period.
If you had the power to do so, what would you change in Thousand Oaks?
I don't think I would change anything. I think the city has ended up just fine. I think maybe the only thing I'd say I'd like to see a little closer association and cooperation, the city with the school district. I think that more of the emphasis has been on the city and its concerns rather than on the schools and their concerns. I think the effort should have been more towards education and less towards city. That would be the only negative that I would have.
Is there one person that you would single out as having the greatest impact on the history of the Conejo Valley?
Yes, there is. I think it's going down to the very roots. Mrs. Florence Jans, the matriarch. She took a boat ride after the San Francisco earthquake, and she met, the reason of that boat ride, the tour, she met Dr. Edwin Jans. And Dr. Edwin Jans had two sons, Ed and Bill Jans, and they took over the company in the early 50s, and they made this decision that was extraordinary. And that was to make that quantum leap from the West Valley to here, to start a sewer company, a water company, to build infrastructure, roads, and to take all those risks, to get this city started with its own personality rather than just part of urban sprawl. So I think Mrs. Jans took a boat ride.
What's your greatest accomplishment since you've been here in Thousand Oaks?
You know, my life here has certainly made me humble, because I could, about 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, I was coming home from work one day, and I thought I'd accomplished a lot. I'm making all sorts of decisions as president of the Jans Investment Corporation, getting things done, and high-powered. I was right on the ball, and I stopped at a signal, and the Roto-Rooter man's truck came next to me. And I looked over there and said, couldn't survive without him. He's far more important than anything I've ever done. And that stuck with that my importance is not that much. And I can't think of anything other than just I was competent, I was honest in my job, and I got along well with my employees and my bosses, who are great, great friends. That's just had a good career.
What are your hopes for the future of Thousand Oaks?
Well, my age, I don't have a lot of hopes for the future. I think I just can't believe what's happening in the world today. The economy is so strong, so long. I've never experienced anything like that. And if it goes on, and we can just maintain what we have in Thousand Oaks, would have been done a wonderful, wonderful goal, objective.
How much or how little has Thousand Oaks grown since you've been here?
It was a village of 2,500 people. To what it is now, 100-odd thousand, I'm not sure of the number.
What do you think is the greatest treasure the city of Thousand Oaks has to offer its residents?
Well, it's so many. It's location, it's climate, it's form of government, it's the basic honesty that's been built into this to be the shock of anybody in the whole world. I read about San Bernardino in the paper today, that this city has gone all these years without one single scandal of any kind. And I just think that they just keep doing that. It's going in the name of these, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't need fixing.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing Thousand Oaks?
To maintain the status quo. That's a challenge.
Who are your heroes?
Heroes?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're all very, very fine people. I wouldn't think of them in terms of heroes. I just think there are just so many people. I'd start listing them that there's if you had a rating of 10 to be the very tops, there's probably 50 people that are pretty close to 10, so I couldn't start naming any one of them without putting down the other 49. So I just wouldn't want to start naming people. They're all very, very fine bunch of people.
Do you have a personal motto?
Not at this stage, no.
How would you like history to remember you?
Well, I don't think it's... I found out, fortunately I found out very, very early. In fact, people that never found it out, and that under every tombstone lies a man that thought he was indispensable. I thought I was very fortunate finding that out while I'm alive. I don't think I'll be remembered, and it's not important that I be remembered. I don't really care if I'm remembered.
Are there any questions that we should ask you that we haven't asked you?
No, not really. I think you've had a very comprehensive questionnaire about bringing out the thoughts and background and experiences and valuations of the people that were involved in the history of the city.
Any particular memories that are really pleasant to think back on?
Well, no, I think getting Bill Jans, I never stopped being amazed at how they're not really remembered the way they should have been remembered. That decision that they made, risking the whole family fortune, and making that move and coming out here 15 miles away from the nearest development and starting the city, and that's exactly what they did. They had to have a sewer, they had to have a water company, they had to have roads, they had to have somebody willing to put in all that money, and they did that. And I did studies for them as a financial man, and if they just held on and sold it at capital gains, they would have made so much more money, but they wouldn't have accomplished what they accomplished. And they weren't glorifying their names. I remember one time they were talking about changing the name of La Granada to Jans Road, because Jans Road and La Granada went together. And that Jans asked, they wanted to change the whole thing to Jans Road. And that Jans asked that they turn the whole thing in and change it to Granadas rather than Jans. So they were very low profile that way, and but they did it. I very admired them for what they did. Very proud to have been associated with them. And the matriarch was a lovely, lovely woman.
Well, Joe, thank you for coming in today.
Well, it's been a pleasure being here. Well, at Loyola University, I joined the V7 program, which is a naval officer training program that let you graduate from college. So I graduated in 1943, went to Northwestern, to midshipman school at Northwestern's graduate college in downtown in the Loop. That was a wonderful experience there, 90 days. From there I came out back to the Pacific Coast, and I served as harbor entrance control, something or other, son of boys, listened for submarines, and did nothing but sit around there. And then I was assigned overseas to, first to Peleliu, where I spent about 6 months. You remember the great book, I think, of Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts pretty well described my military experience in the Navy, just boredom, tedium and boredom. And I came home in 1945, married, became a CPA, practiced a CPA, had my own practice. And then I started, my family, started a family, had 5 children. Oldest was Sam, who's now mid-40s, and he started first he had an ice cream parlor here in Thousand Oaks that I helped him finance and get going. And that was a disaster. But out of that, he came up with a commodity, a product called Matterhorn, which is one of those ice cream cones with you probably, I can't think of they call them, with the chocolate covered with the drumsticks.
Sprinkles, yeah.
Drumsticks, yeah. And that did amazingly well. He ended up having to move up to Idaho, where he got cheaper cream and found a great plant, and developed that business into a $7 million business, and he sold it and retired at age 45. And then my daughter, Adrian, is home with us still, taking care of her mother and myself. We're beginning to get close to that 80 year. And then my daughter, Adrian, Rachel, is married to a professor, and my son, Joe Jr., is post group in public relations. He's a public relations officer for post group. And my younger son, Ben, lived his whole life with us in that same house. He's with us, and he's a Jehovah's Witness and full-time minister. And out here, I got contact with Jans about 58 and started doing all that work for him. And pretty soon I was hired on board, and then pretty soon as president of the company. And one year I went off to the early year. We bought the Sun Valley Ski Resort in 1964. I went up and I was the manager of the Sun Valley Ski Resort. I've never been in the snow in my life. That was lived up there for a year. That was an extraordinary experience. But we ran the resort. Somebody not knowing anything about it was a good experience. And Bill Jans eventually took that over and ran that. And he sold it out to Utah people some 20 years ago. And then I came back and I was involved in the feed yard. One time we had over 100,000 head of cattle on thermal down the desert. We'd fatten up cattle and sell them, and that was quite an experience. And then I was, about 1980, it became clear that, well, it became clear earlier than that, about 1970, that the corporation, there was fourth generation. That's an interesting part in itself, that the original was Dr. Peter Jans, who's a medical doctor, came out here from Nebraska, and he developed with Boyle Heights, which is downtown Los Angeles. That he had a son, two sons, Edward and Harold, and Edwin was a board surgeon in World War I. He was an officer in World War I. He came back, gave up his medical practice, and he developed Westwood. The Jans family developed Westwood. They still go there, and the Jan Steps are the main part of the campus there. And then they developed a lot of the San Fernando Valley in the 20s and early 30s. And then Bill and Ed came along in Thousand Oaks. They weren't doctors, but then Bill's son, we set the company up for finally to be broken up, because there were about 12, 15 parties of interest, and we couldn't do anything tax-wise as long as Mrs. Jans was alive. So we structured it so when she died, we could go ahead and split things up, and we did that. So everybody had their own little melon and do their own thing with it, and they all went their different ways and did different things. And Bill Jans Jr., who was a board internist, gave up medicine and went into the business of construction and all. He didn't do well. He had some he's back practicing medicine. He had a financial disasters. And then Larry, is local here and has his interest in various things. Gold Coast is the theater group and all. And his other brother up in, they're all over the country, but they're all doing their own thing now.
So was the Jans Corporation located out in Thousand Oaks, or were they located when you joined them? They were located somewhere else?
No, they were pretty well. When I located, we had offices down in Westwood, in West Los Angeles. And then we moved out here in our entirety in 1971. The corporation split up, like Harold and Ed split up in the mid-50s, took the different ways, and then we split it up again in about 1982 with all the different members taking their own interest in it. And I pretty well stayed. I was the executor and trustee for both Ed and Bill Jans. I was very, very close to both of them. They were very close friends of mine. We were good friends.
When you talked with the principals about Thousand Oaks and what they planned to do, what was the original concept of dealing with the
Stanford
land?
Research Institute did a very comprehensive plan where you're going to have a balance of industry, commercial, residential, and the whole thing would function as a community within itself. And that didn't work out that way. They built the houses out here, and the people from the valley and everybody came out and commuted back and forth. But then now you're getting more into that deal with Amgen and all the others, and there are an awful lot of people that live and work here. So that was their plan originally, to make it that way.
So 35, 36 years later, that's actually turning out to be at least partially the way that the community is operating.
Right.
And you moved out in 1971, is that right?
No, I became involved with Jans in 1958.
When did you actually move to the community?
62.
62?
I moved here in 62.
It was still mainly a good portion farmland at that point.
Oh yeah, the population was probably about 10,000, 12,000 when I moved out here.
Do you remember what some of the issues were back in 1962?
Well,
having to deal with the community?
Corporation and the city, whether we should be a city or remain a, whether the name should be, whether it should be Thousand Oaks or Conejo Valley. That was a big issue when there was an election in 1964. That was the first issue. And then even to that, Newbury Park, parts of it decided to stay out, didn't want to become part. And so they were excluded from the formation of the city. And then after that, the Rockwell International, that plant, you know where it is, way off on the, that was out there. And the people, well, that was a big, big issue. big environmental issue, and man, there's lawsuits and what going on. Then the Oaks Regional Shopping Center in 1974 was a big issue. Then this right here was a big issue. And I was, I've been involved like school bonds. I've worked very hard on several energy committees and school bonds and all sorts of committees I've been involved with the city. I was very, very active. I used to go to all the council meetings, but about 20 years ago I stopped. About mid-80s maybe, or early 80s. I quit going, but I was very involved. It was I got a kick out of the people. I was saying earlier, they'd come out and there would be a track next to their house coming in, and they'd be against it, you know, because close the gate I'm in.
What issue were you most passionate about in all the
Well, I was
issues
very
that you dealt
passionate
with?
on the structure of this, the redevelopment district. Do you understand the redevelopment district concept here?
Well, you tell me about it.
Well, redevelopment district, you had circa 1974. You had Thousand Oaks was beginning to come alive. The values of the boulevard were beginning to increase, and you could see where all the property taxes were going to start really going up. And so they declared a redevelopment district, Thousand Oaks Boulevard, from Thousand Oaks and Moore Park down to the high school, Westlake High School. And the effect of that was that any increased collections and property taxes above and beyond that base year would go to the city to use for redevelopment. And they had to have a finding that there was blight to the extent it was a serious impact on the social, economic, and physical welfare of the city that the private community as acting alone could not solve. Well, the city council made the finding, but it was just wrong. It was vibrant. They took the heart of the city, one of the most vibrant economic, and they used redevelopment, which suggests that there's this serious economic impact of physical, social, and welfare of the community. But it was just booming. But it's legal, and they made that finding. Nobody could challenge the finding. But when they reap off all the property taxes, well, 60% of that formerly went to the schools for education, but that was now taken away from the schools. But don't worry about that, because the state, California, makes that up. They out of there and brings it up to per diem under whatever the Serrano, whatever that law was. So it's not, we're not tuck house in the school or everything, but every community was doing it. And so you're just sucking money out of the school system for civic and city purposes. That was not right. That was not right. And I was very vociferous in that I thought it was wrong. It was not a good thing to do, but it was done. And we built this, and when they started building it, I gave them $1,000, bought one of the seats, and I've been supportive of it ever since. But the idea was wrong, and it's still wrong.
In your opinion, what defines Thousand Oaks as being unique, or is it a unique city?
Well, I think it defines it because it's of that quantum leap. You had a city that could grow from itself. It didn't have to be just the metropolis expanding and moving out, coming closer and closer, and then add on. It was started from scratch, 15 miles away from any other development. So it had its own personality. It didn't just achieve the personality from the next door neighbors as it grew out this way. It became one where the people became very involved. It was their city. They weren't just an extension of another couple of streets. And I think that set a pattern in Thousand Oaks, gave it an identity that was very much its own identity. That makes it unusual.